I did a little research on Mary Oliver. I'd like to share some of that with you. And then I did send a poetry packet out, and I'm hoping most of you have it so you can actually look at the poems in front of you. If not, I will be attempting, I say attempting, to share those poems in what's called share screen, so that you can see them when we read them, even if you don't have them in front of you. So that's kind of the plan. Okay. With that said, what I want to do first is just kind of go over with you a little bit of what I've learned about Mary Oliver. I mean, I think we all have some opinions about her, but what I've done is I've gone to Wikipedia and online obituaries of Mary Oliver after she died in January of 2019, excuse me. And I've also listened to an interview she did with Krista Tippett. Krista Tippett is someone who does a podcast called On Being. And that podcast is one of the very few interviews that Mary Oliver ever gave. It was in the year 2015, so it was 4 years before her death, and it was in Florida, and it was after her longtime partner had died. So she was down living in Florida by herself. Very interesting interview, and yeah, so there was a lot of interesting insight, I think, into Mary Oliver as a result of that. And the other thing that I've done is I've read essays in this book called Blue Pastures, which is a book of essays that Mary Oliver wrote herself. And it gives some insight into both her persona, her background, her sensibilities, but also a lot of information about her poetic process, how she came to poetry, the poets and poems that she has loved over the years. And so I'm hoping that you'll find some of that interesting and instructive, and perhaps a little bit different from what you already know. So with that, by way of preamble, I'm just going to kind of spend 10 or 15 minutes, and then we'll have some discussion about kind of this part of the presentation. So Mary Oliver was born in Maple Heights, Ohio, which was a semi-rural suburb of Cleveland in 1935. Her father was a social studies teacher. His name was Edward William Oliver. And he was also an athletics coach in the Cleveland Public Schools. She spent a lot of time outside, and one of the interviews that she gave with the Christian Science Monitor in 1992, here is what she said about growing up in kind of a rural area. Quote, "It was pastoral, it was nice, it was an extended family. I don't know why I felt such an affinity with the natural world, except that it was available to me. That's the first thing. It was right there. And for whatever reasons, I felt those first important connections, those first experiences being made with the natural world rather than with the social world." That's, I think, a very, that's true, by the way, about her, but it doesn't tell the whole truth. And we're going to get a little bit more into the whole truth as we go on. So years later, in 2011, she was interviewed by Maria Shriver. And frankly, the prospect of Maria Shriver and Mary Oliver in the same room kind of baffled me. But she was interviewed by Maria Shriver for O Magazine. And at that point, for whatever reason, Maria Shriver pulled out of Mary Oliver that she'd been sexually abused as a child and that she had recurring nightmares. So we're going to look at a couple of Mary Oliver's poems that came out of her book, Dreamwork, which she published in 1986. And you will hear a lot of bitterness towards her father in those poems. When she was interviewed with Krista Tippett, now this is 4 years before she died, she was asked about her father, and she said, quote, "He got no love from me. He didn't deserve it." So what we can see is that even 4 years before her death, she was estranged and bitter, and I think that she strove mightily to overcome those feelings towards her father. We don't see a lot of that in her work. I would argue we see the opposite of that, which is a striving for healing in the natural world, in the out of doors, which is where she was safe from him. So I'm going to read you a couple of pages from her book about her experience of escaping. She doesn't specifically say this is escaping from her father as a child, but I think we can read between the lines. She says that basically, I experienced a crisis of delinquent student behavior. And my response was to start out for school every morning, but to turn most mornings into the woods instead, with a knapsack of books, always Whitman among them. Quote, "Down by the creek or in the wide pastures, I could still find on the other side of the deep woods. I spent my time with my friend, my brother, my uncle, my best teacher." And then she quotes Whitman. "The moth and the fish eggs are in their place. The suns I see and the suns I cannot see are in their place. The palpable is in its place, and the impalpable is in its place." Thus, Whitman's poem stood before me like a model of delivery when I began to write poems myself. I mean, the oceanic power and rumble that travels through a Whitman poem, the incantatory syntax, the boundless affirmation. In those years, truth was elusive, as was my own faith that I could recognize and contain it. Whitman kept me from the swamps of a worse uncertainty, and I lived many hours within the lit circle of his certainty and his bravado, and his faith that kept my spirit buoyant surely, though his faith was without a name that I ever heard of. And for me, that's very telling. I think that we know that Mary Oliver did not have a classic faith in a deity that she could name, but she definitely had a faith in the natural world. And you can see her. I think we can see a lot of Whitman showing up in her work. We'll look at that a little bit later. She started writing poetry at the age of 14. She graduated from her local high school. She did a couple of years in college later on. She never actually got a college degree. But at 17, she went to Steeplechase, the home of Edna St. Vincent Millay in Austerlitz, New York. And she actually formed a friendship with Norma. Edna St. Vincent Millay had died at that point. And she worked on assembling the papers, assembling the work of Edna St. Vincent Millay. Again, I said that I think it's odd to think of Maria Shriver and Mary Oliver in the same room. I also think it's odd to think of Edna St. Vincent Millay and Mary Oliver together in the same room. It's much easier for me to imagine Whitman and Mary Oliver in the same room. And yet, there's something about Millay's work that I do believe worked its way into Mary Oliver's consciousness. It's something about a longing. And we'll talk about that a little more. I'm sure you all have views about that. As you see in your packet, I did include a Millay poem. I tried to include a poem by the people that, from my reading, I felt most influenced Mary Oliver. And I think it's hard to imagine being 17 years old and spending 6 or 7 years with the work of Edna St. Vincent Millay and not in some way being affected by it. But again, we'll talk about that and see what you think. When she was working on those papers, she met Molly Malone Cook. And Molly Malone Cook was a photographer. She became her lifelong partner. And many of you know this. Together they lived primarily near Provincetown on Cape Cod. Cook ran a little bookstore in town, and Mary Oliver wrote poems. And Mary Oliver did do some teaching, but teaching was really not her vocation. Her vocation was being a writer. So Cook died in 2005. Now, I've heard it said that Cook was really kind of like a gatekeeper for Mary Oliver, that she tried to give her the freedom to write and the time to write, and kind of keep the public at bay. And whether that's true or not, who knows? We do know that Mary Oliver did not, as I say, give a lot of interviews. So as I mentioned, Mary Oliver died in Florida in January of 2019 at the age of 83. She had been diagnosed with lung cancer about, I think, 2 years before. This would have been 2013, 2 years before she talked to Krista Tippett. She said, "I have a clean bill of health." And what's interesting to me is you could hear her smoking on the interview. And Krista Tippett said to her, "And you're still smoking?" And Mary Oliver said, "Yes, I am." Now, again, I had a hard time visualizing Mary Oliver, this poet of the wild, as being a smoker. But I think, again, it reveals part of the contradiction of this woman, and I find that to be fascinating. So what she actually died of was not lung cancer, it was lymphoma, and that's what she died of in 2019. As I mentioned, she did study at Ohio State and Vassar in the mid-50s, but she did not get a degree. And when she was talking to Krista Tippett, she said, in my early years in Cape Cod, we were very poor. We really didn't have any money. And she said, then the townspeople just accepted me as another person who lived in town. Like, they'd say, "How's your work going, Mary?" And she said, "Oh, great. How's your work going?" And they say, "Oh, great. We're down at the town dump." She said, "I was down at the town dump looking for shingles for my house when I heard about the Pulitzer Prize." And I think we do get that kind of homespun feeling about Mary Oliver. So I'm going to give you a quote from one of the obituaries. The man, the writer was Philip Hoare, and he said, quote, "Molly and Mary were at their best in Provincetown. Their house seemed to have grown around them. Its windows looked out from green shingled walls onto the limpid light of Cape Cod Bay and past the harbor breakwater where schools of dolphins swam. At night, they watched the blinking green light of Long Point Lighthouse. Their rooms were filled with light, books, people, and animals, all seemingly spilling in from the beach that ran outside their back door." What I think is interesting about that quote is it makes it sound as if they were a very sociable lot and they had a lot of people in their home. I don't actually believe that was true. There were animals. That is definitely true. And Mary Oliver wrote about her dog and dogs, and they clearly were very important in her life. But it's just interesting, isn't it, to see how, after you've gone, people can make up their own stories about you. And I'm not saying that he's lying, but it's one view of one person. And I personally believe that Mary Oliver always wore a cloak of aloneness about her. It's clear she was a solitary child. She felt unloved. And I want to just read you a little portion from her book of essays where she talks about quite literally being forgotten by her father. She says, "Once my father took me ice skating, then forgot me and went home. He was, of course, reminded that I had been with him and sent back, but this was hours later. I had been found wandering over the ice and taken to the home of a kind young woman who knew my family slightly. She had phoned them to say where I was. When my father came through the door, I thought, never had I seen so handsome a man. He talked, he laughed, his movements were smooth and easy, his blue eyes were clear. He had simply, he said, forgotten that I existed. One could see, I can see even now, in memory, what an alleviation, what a lifting from burden he had felt in those few hours. It lay on him, that freedom, like an aura. Then I put on my coat and we got into the car, and he sat back in the awful prison of himself. The old veils covered his eyes, and he did not say another word. Well, yeah, I mean, the hairs on my arm are sticking up. That is a classic example of not only physical, but emotional abandonment. And she lived with it all her life, and she never resolved it. And that I find to be completely heartbreaking. And so it's no wonder that she spent a lot of time outdoors seeking, some comfort and some love outdoors. I'm not going to go through all of her accomplishments. Most of you can look that up for yourself. She did win the National Book Award, and her 5th collection of poetry, called American Primitive, won the Pulitzer Prize for Poetry in 1984. In her National Book Award winning book, which was called When Death Comes, was called New and Selected Poems, 1992. She wrote a poem. We're not going to look at it today. It's called When Death Comes. But at the end of the poem, she says, "When it's over, I want to say, all my life, I was a bride married to amazement. I was the bridegroom, taking the world into my arms." And I think we see there that unique marrying of the sensibilities, you can call it the yin and the yang, or the feminine and the masculine, or whatever you want. But for me, it's that contradiction in Mary Oliver, which makes her such a fascinating poet, that she says that there's both the bride married to amazement and the bridegroom taking the world into my arms.
Could I ask a question real quick?
Yes.
What about her mother?
She has written nothing about her mother. There is nothing in her
So
book.
we don't know anything.
Yeah, excuse me. Somebody probably needs to mute themselves because we've got some background noise.
I didn't open the box. It's
Ed, can you help me?
shipping box.
I'm not sure who it is. That's
Well, what you can do is mute everybody. Mute everybody, and then when
Okay.
people want to speak, they can raise their hand. That might be.
okay. You have to unmute yourself now.
Okay, I got it. Yeah, so I was just curious because, so there's nothing, huh? Oh, Charlene, you have to unmute yourself.
I don't recall anything about her mother, and I've read a fair amount about Mary Oliver, so not to my knowledge.
Christine, you're muted at the moment.
Christine, you have to unmute, or maybe I can find you and unmute you. Hold on. I'm not used to all this power.
Thank you.
Okay.
So now I want to give you kind of a little bit of me, and I know that there'll be some of you talking about Mary Oliver as well. I do believe Mary Oliver is perhaps one of the best known American poets. She is probably the most frequently quoted at weddings and funerals. And I think she has a unique combination of a detailed, clear-eyed vision of the natural world, combined with questions of a spiritual nature. Kristen Tippett always asks people at the beginning of her interviews, can you tell me something about the nature of your religious training, affiliation as a young person? And Mary Oliver said, well, as a young girl, I went to Sunday school, but she said in her own wry way, but I had a problem with the resurrection. And so, so her problem with the resurrection led to her not being I think she might have been actually part of a religious community, a Unitarian community on Cape Cod. But her musings about God are real. And she's not denying the influence of a spirit, but she's also not typically religious in the sense that we might think. I think, and I'll again be interested in what you say, but I think that the themes that predominate in her poetry are the unity of all beings, the purpose of life, the nature of God with a small g, or the spiritual world. Yet there is also grief, a grief she describes as a bag of stones she carries with her everywhere. And again, in her book of essays, she says, there are the stubborn stumps of shame, grief that remains unsolvable after all these years, a bag of stones that goes with one wherever one goes, and however the hour may call for dancing and for light feet. But there is also the summoning world, the admirable energies of the world, better than anger, better than bitterness, and because more interesting, more alleviating. And then she goes on to say, and there is the thing that one does, the work. Having chosen to claim my life, I have made for myself out of work and love a handsome life. So, again, there is that combination, that contradiction of the bag of stones and then having made a handsome life. Her poems can be deceptive because they are generally plain spoken and understandable. Yet she was a craftsman, and she writes of her early self-education in classical poets such as Keats. Her book of essays, which I'm reading from, and her interview with Krista Tippett give some insight into her writing process. She definitely talks about how poems echo other poems, which is one theme we'll look at today in her work. And she told Krista Tippett that Wild Geese, a poem we will look at today, was actually written as a craft exercise. She was teaching a class and she wanted to explain the use of end-stopped lines. And so I think this is amazing. She wrote one of her best loved poems as a craft exercise. And when she referred to end-stopped lines, Krista Tippett said, "What's an end-stopped line?" And of course, we wouldn't expect anything different. Krista Tippett's not a poet, but I just thought that's actually kind of funny when you think about it. As I mentioned, we're also going to talk about her anger at her father and how I believe her early attempts to save herself in the outdoors may have affected her decision to write repeatedly about the natural world. So the last two poems in your packet, Rage and A Visitor, I think qualify as what I would call confessional poetry. However, Mary Oliver did not like confessional poetry, and I'm going to read you a little bit about what she said about that. Quote, "Poems of the confessional school are so often aggrieved and aggressive, frantic and self-involved. They seem to me more catharsis than art, more memoir than poem. I turn from them having learned a little about the authors perhaps, but nothing at all about the world beyond personal frenzy, the huge energies it can produce, the darkness it can long for, the anguish and anger that can pour forth from it like rain. In 100 years, I suspect such poems will be seen as a derivative of therapy." Well, okay. So I think it's fascinating to me anyway, that she's written two poems that I would consider to be confessional poems. She talks about the I in her poetry and how her intention for the I is to be a universal I, that she intends to disappear into her work and not have it be about her own personal experience. So I think, as I say, I think it's all, fascinating to think about. And I just want to end this too long introduction, for which I apologize. When you listen to the Krista Tippett interview, you will hear her at the very end say, "I'm free, I'm free." And in that moment, I heard a 5-year-old who had been trapped in her home. She'd been basically giving an interview, which she both probably did and did not want to give. And that ebullience in those words, I'm free, I could just hear really the real Mary Oliver, who who really did want to be free. So that's my way of introduction, and I thank you for bearing with me on this. And now I'm going to open it up to thoughts about Mary Oliver, perhaps your favorite poems. Use the raise hand function if you can, and we'll unmute you one at a time to share whatever you'd like to share.
Can I cut in here just and promote something?
Yes.
This is, hopefully you can see this. This is a book she wrote about writing poetry. It's not very expensive. I swear by it. I'm enamored of Mary Oliver to begin with, and I think it's less than $10 as I remember to buy it used. So and well worth
Fan
it.
club.
Ed, why don't you just read the title of it for those who couldn't see it?
Sure. It's Mary Oliver, a Poetry Handbook, a prose guide to understanding and writing poetry. Very, very uncomplicated, almost jargonless, but pretty thorough, and I highly recommend it.
Thank you very much.
And the retail on it is $15, but you can, if you go on eBay, you can buy it for nothing.
So reactions to anybody learn anything new about Mary Oliver? Anything they want to share about her, your own personal favorites before we look at the poems? And again, if you want to share, okay, that is Dorian. Okay, you're unmuted.
Hi, Christine. These poems that we're comparing, the poems by Rumi and the ones that you sent out in the packet, who put those together?
I did.
They were great. I thought they were
Good.
very compatible. They made me like Mary Oliver better, and they made me really enjoy those poems that you combined them with. They were spot on.
I will say this, that in her interview with Krista Tippett, Mary Oliver said, these days I'm reading mostly Rumi. She said, my poems are getting shorter and I'm reading mostly Rumi. And so that was kind of my motivation for looking for a Rumi poem. But no, these are just things that I came up with to talk about.
Mm-hmm. Good.
Thanks. Pat Hale, where are you? Where are you? Wait.
I am muted.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm going to unmute you. No, you're not muted.
I've always loved The Summer Day and Wild Geese, but I had the opportunity to hear Mary Oliver read in New York at a fundraiser, and I was so excited to hear her that I was practically shaking when she came in, and she read entirely about dogs.
Yeah. Yeah.
One dog poem after another.
And let me add, Pat, to your point. So Krista Tippett actually took what I thought was a pretty bold move, which was during the interview, she played for Mary Oliver, Krista Tippett's daughter, when she was 12, reading The Summer Day.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's a little bit of guts. And Krista Tippett called it A Summer Day. And Mary Oliver said, no, it's The Summer Day. And I thought, that's the mark of a craftsperson. The difference between A and the is critical to a poet. And I just thought, how interesting. But yes, there are certain talisman poems. And so Krista Tippett, and of course, Mary Oliver said, very positive things about her daughter's rendition of The Summer Day. But I just thought that was fascinating. So, anybody else wish to speak?
Can I sneak in one more anecdote and then I'll shut up?
Of course.
For the last 20 years or so, I've spent a couple weeks a year up in Provincetown. And the first summer, there's really only one bookshop in town, and I discovered it, and I discovered that they had a stash of Mary Oliver autograph books. Thank you very much. And I would buy one or two of them every year faithfully and bring them back to our little timeshare and read them, and then immediately proceed to write really crappy imitations of Mary Oliver poetry. And I discovered if I read her stuff, I had to let it subside for a few days before I tried to do my own material.
Hmm.
It was too contagious for me.
Yeah. And I think that a lot of people mistakenly think that she's just writing about the natural world, and don't get that there's another element to it that may be subtle, but it's so important. So, Patty, speak to us, maybe.
Go ahead.
That's from before, I think.
Oh, okay. Laura?
No, it's Vic. Go ahead.
Oh,
No,
Vic.
I just wondered
you.
if we had any information about her Vassar years and why she left.
I don't. And,
I don't.
but does anybody? 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 I think, I'm going to guess on it. She really was, she was self-taught. And I think that any situation that kind of, she was obviously a introvert, any situation that kind of closed her in made her feel trapped. And I don't know that that's the case with her education, but obviously it didn't keep her from winning the Pulitzer Prize. So there you go. Okay, Robert.
I read Rumi and Mary Oliver pretty much every night. But you know, Rumi was into Sufism. How do you think Mary was related to that? Which I think is wonderful, but
You're asking me?
Yeah, what was her relationship with Sufism?
Yeah, I personally think that Mary Oliver entered into the energy of other people's poetry, and not so much the kind of the intellectual content of it. There was something about Rumi's
You're right, yeah.
groundedness and his view that the world was so much bigger than you could see with the eye that I think really appealed to her. But unfortunately, we can't ask her now, so we don't know. But good question.
You can't ask either one of them.
Just also true. Margaret? I'm unmuting you, I hope. Oh, I'm not.
Okay. I love how you quoted her taking the world into my arms and using that just after you talked about her immersion in Malay's work when Oliver was very young. When I was a teenager and our teachers talked poetry to us, they used Malay a lot as an example. And I remember writing in my journal, "Oh world, I cannot hold you close enough," as a quote. And how amazed I was when you referred to Oliver self-quoting, taking the world into my arms later in her life. And I thought, how must it have been for a very young poet to be intimately connected to another female poet and then capture some kinship, even if it was ultimately embracing the world. And I'm grateful that you found that quote. It's quite a lovely circle.
It is, isn't it, Margaret? Thank you, yeah, for your comment. And it just, there's always more to learn, and that's what I hope. Yeah, that's what I hope Poets on Poetry can do for us.